All right, friends, we're going to start in just a minute if you want to get yourself comfortable. I want to let you know there are a lot of charts and graphs on the screen itself, so you may want to be in a position to be able to see them. And I understand from Steve that we're live at home as well. So welcome, everybody. As we all know, you're here because you're interested in Israel and informed about Israel. There's a lot of turmoil going on right now, and we're going to do a deep dive into what's going on and what the causes are and what the outcomes may or may not be. And again, among this group, there are some people that are quite informed, and if you have any comments, they're more than welcome. Any questions, certainly those too are welcome, and I'll do my best to answer them. I start in a very calming way. How many know the name Ofra Hazan? Ofra Haza. Ofra was the Madonna of Israel. She died a number of years ago. Hauntingly beautiful voice, and I start with a 90-second rendition of Jerusalem of Gold. And for those of you who have been to Israel a number of times, you're going to recognize the street scenes, because while she's singing, it's just a photo review of Jerusalem. So I just thought it was just a calming way to begin. I thought it was a calming way to begin. It's very calm. The computer that we have is not my own. It belongs to the temple. Mine was not communicating with the screen, so we changed it and the music was working. But I guess we'll just bypass the music. I always start, incidentally, I've done this specific presentation for about 15 years in various groups, other synagogues, a few churches on occasion, so on and so forth. And I always begin with the population, and these numbers are through December 31st, 2022. And you could see that the numbers have popped up by over 200,000, and it is projected that Israel will hit a population of 10 million in 2 years, barring any unforeseen circumstances, positive or negative. Negative meaning if the turmoil continues, they may lose population. If something happens worse in Ukraine and Russia, then those numbers can pop up. So you're looking at 10 million population probably in 2 years. Aliyah, that's a picture of Aliyah for 2022. There was a huge jump in Russia and Ukraine. Those numbers were more than doubled over the past few years, over the past year. Interestingly enough, more people left Russia and Ukraine to go to Germany than they did to come to Israel. I find that kind of interesting, particularly because of the past, Jews, yeah. USA 3,500, that actually represents Mexico and Canada. It was North America. France has been steady around the 2,000 number. Belarus, they're frightened there. Those numbers are up. The Ethiopian situation, as a personal note, for a number of years, I headed up for Federation Ethiopian Resettlement for the City of Atlanta's funding. And so I'm very sensitive to Ethiopian immigration. Right now, there are about 5,500 to 6,000 Ethiopians still there. The issue, of course, is determining the legitimacy of their Judaism, whether they come in under the law of return or whether they just come in as citizens. They're all welcome. As a side note, the Minister of Absorption is an Ethiopian woman. She's the first Ethiopian in the cabinet and in the history of Israel, and happens to be a woman doing a terrific job, and she was with the prior administration as well. The United Kingdom would have been higher except for the new government, the last two prime ministers, and Boris Johnson, well, actually, last three, starting with Boris Johnson. The situation for Jews in England has changed, and I'll talk about that at the very end, very briefly. And then you see the stragglers, South Africa and Brazil. The breakdown by faith is we surpassed over 7 million Jewish Israelis, 2 million Arabs. It represents, if you can see it, 74% and 21%. Those percentages have not changed, plus or minus 2% over the last 4 or 5 years. And others are non-Arab Christians and a number of other smaller faiths. Jewish affiliation in Israel is always an interesting number too. 45% of Israelis consider themselves secular, and the balance is split up by the ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox, traditional, which I have not been able to determine exactly who the traditional are, because to me, the modern Orthodox, which would be the pink, and traditional are pretty much the same, but the information I had this year split them up. You can see in Reform Judaism, if you take the number of Jews in Israel of about 7 million, 3%, it's a little over 200,000 identify themselves as Reform Jews, and then a little smaller number, 1/3 less, consider themselves conservative Jews. They have not changed much at all. As I look, Bill, I'm looking at the numbers now. The ultra-Orthodox, I've seen it 10%, I've seen it 11%, I've seen it as high as 12% in other surveys, but no, if I had last year's chart up there, it would be almost the same. No, no. Yes. Does it include who? Oh, no, of course not. Oh, no. This is Israel proper, not Judea and Samaria for some, the West Bank for others. No, it doesn't include the Arab population from those areas at all, because you have over 2 million there. Well, they play with funny numbers, because for political purposes, very often the Palestinian Authority will use numbers of people that left years ago. So what the real number is, it's probably more like 1.3 million, 1.4 million. Now, hundreds of thousands they count on their rolls. How do you count the Palestinians living in East Jerusalem? Are they Israeli or not? So there are numbers that are played with that. But does that answer the question? Yes. The Druze, yeah, the Druze are in the other section, right. You have the Baha'is, you have the Druze, you have the Armenians, I mean, the Roman Catholics, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sorry? The ultra-Orthodox are those that are quite identifiable. They're the most religious, the most Torah-oriented. I mean, you can't get more religious in our terms than the ultra-Orthodox. They're the ones that have the payas, and the women, of course, are totally covered almost, no masks on the face, but totally covered. Those are the ultra-Orthodox. And they have different sects of the ultra-Orthodox, and a lot of them come from New York City. The Satmars, one group of ultra-Orthodox, as a matter of fact, they're probably when I say this respectfully, that they're the least tolerant, the Satmars. And the Satmars can be identified with the white leggings, if you've seen them walking around with the white leggings. And they do come from Brooklyn. Each year I come up with potpourri, and it's just a group of unrelated, interesting factors over the prior year that interested me and I thought would be of interest to the people that I speak with. Of course, this is the big anniversary this year, the diamond anniversary, 75 years, going to be celebrated next month. So that speaks for itself. I found the second one, Israeli supermodel, Shlomit Malka, became Shabbat observant. Why is that so interesting? Number one, she spends half her time at least living in New York City. And for her to become Shoma Shabbos, which she has, means she's giving up a lot of gigs. She's giving up a lot of income because she's not going to work from Friday sundown to Saturday. She's going to limit insofar as what she's eating, of course, so on and so forth. It's a life-changing, it's life-changing for her, and she just decided to do that, which after she became this supermodel, I thought it was kind of interesting. I also thought the number of there are 30 known Israeli billionaires these days. Ron Derma, I mentioned that for a couple of reasons. He is probably the closest person to Benjamin Netanyahu on a personal level and on a political level. Ron grew up in Miami Beach, Florida, went to Beach High. His father, Jay, was mayor of Miami Beach. He made Aliyah as a young man, got involved in politics. He was ambassador to the United States under the last Netanyahu government. And I recently finished Bibi with Netanyahu's autobiography, and he considers Ron Derma one of his best friends in the world and closest confidant. So that's why I plugged it in there. And I find it so interesting, a kid that grew up, I lived in Miami Beach for a number of years, so for a kid to grow up in Miami Beach and be the closest confidant of the Prime Minister of Israel, I thought was very interesting. Yes?
Does the 30 known Israeli billionaires include the 10 recent Russian rockets?
Ray, they didn't define who their backgrounds are. They didn't. They're obviously out of the high-tech world. And of course, Aronson's in there. Miriam Aronson, her husband died a year ago, but she's the woman who owns the properties, the gambling properties in Las Vegas and Macau, the biggest casino in Macau, and owner of one of the major newspapers in Israel. That's the wife, and she's in that group of billionaires. I found it interesting that the Israelis are getting into space. They formed a venture capital fund with $125 million to invest in startup companies that are going to focus on space. I thought it, not earth-shattering, but I thought it was interesting that 7-Eleven finally opened in Israel of all places. Why, I don't know. But there's a 7-Eleven now for you to shop. I know a lot of you shop there a lot. I know Arlene does. And then the last item I have is they're going to, Israel, as we know, has incredible museums all over the place. Well, the next time you go, you'll be able to visit the Einstein Museum. Each year I also do innovations. Those, I pick 5 or 6 or 7 new products or services that are being offered by Israel. The first one I found to be the most fascinating because with those who are pushing for the EVs, the electronic vehicles, the big rap against them is, well, you can't fly in an electric plane. Well, guess what? The Israelis developed one. That's an actual picture of that plane. As the chart says, it's a 9-seater, and the test flight ran for 8 minutes at 3,500 feet. And I'm sure they're going to increase the size of that battery and so on and so forth. It's a start. I won't get on it, but maybe all will. The other one, I come out of the printing industry, and I found this to be interesting, only interesting. Reap Technologies came up with a system that takes ink off a printed sheet and totally erases it and gives you a clean sheet to start with. Although the use of paper today is a diminishing number with technology, so I don't know why it's such a big deal, but I had to put it down because of my background. I thought the Pigmentum company producing milk substitute from lettuce was very interesting, particularly as it relates to some of the poor countries in Africa and other places in the world that need milk, that can't afford to raise cattle, can't get cattle, so they have this milk substitute, again, derived from lettuce. I found the Tevel product, the aerobatics, very interesting as well. As you know, Israel is very, very big in growing of fruit, exporting of fruit, many of which comes from trees, and they have to use people to pick those, and they stand on ladders. Now they developed what looks like a little drone that is able to pick fruit faster and without a human being. So again, it will increase production of fruit to be packaged and shipped. The picture at the bottom under the plane is a lady sitting at a pool, and this company developed an outdoor air conditioning unit that runs off nitrogen with no electricity at all. So that has some uses at commercial places, hotels, so on and so forth, or maybe people with pools at home would want them. The last one is a medical. It's a nasal spray to help with PTSD. Did I skip what? Oh, I'm sorry, I sure did. Thank you very much. Cordio developed a smartphone, a cell phone, that can detect heart failure by speaking into it. And as it points out, it picks up fluid buildup in the heart and the lungs based on some algorithms that they have in software that they have in these phones to pick it up. Thank you for pointing that out. The medical technology in Israel is beyond description, without a question. Yes? A lot of these are startups, Chick, and they haven't found their way to the United States yet. And as a matter of fact, some of them aren't even available in Israel. Last year I talked about an automobile, a very small automobile. You know what those, what are they called, the little smart cars that drive around town? Yeah, exactly. One of those cars, she mentions like Ruth Levy drives. Israel developed a car that, because the streets are narrow for parking, that you find a parking space, you push a button, and the car compresses sideways, not front to back. I always thought about going out on a date, and then you want to get a little closer. You push the button, she can't say no. At any rate, and I haven't read where they've produced them in mass yet, so it's just an example of these product like the plane. It's purely in test phase right now. Nobody is flying on those planes yet. Going to the economy, there's good news and bad news, and the good news is the growth. The GDP is 564 billion, showing a growth of 6.3%. The inflation rate in 2022 is 5.3. They're really coming out of the COVID, and the exports hit a record, an absolute record of $160 billion, and you could see who's buying them, mostly Europeans. Tourism was flat, absolutely flat during COVID, obviously. It's starting to bounce back, and they did get 2.6 million visitors in 2022, but if you look at 2019, before COVID hit, you were looking at 4.5 million 4.5 million tourists, which was one of the all-time highs. Hotel occupancy was at 67%. It was, when it was at the 4.5 million, I did that statistic, that number, and it was over 90%, which means full occupancy. And people are betting on the future. There are 12 new hotels scheduled to open this year alone. Now that's the good news. The bad news is, since this judicial reform thing hit, the economy has started to tank. It's really had its effect on it. I'll get into that, a little bit later. But from an economic point of view, it's really damaged Israel. Housing sales, you could see, and the article that I picked that up from was focusing on October, solely October, that month alone, as compared to the prior October, dropped 65%, and in Tel Aviv dropped 85%. But the government is trying to bring the cost of living down with the four-point plan. The interesting dynamic with the four-point plan is they're not cutting out property taxes or fuel taxes or electricity prices and water prices. They're just reducing them. So they're trying to curb the inflationary spiral by doing that, but they're not cutting them out. Staying with the economy, a lot of people don't realize it. As a matter of fact, when I did this 4 weeks ago, there was an Israeli, somebody in the group that grew up in Israel, and when I say challenged me, I don't care if anybody challenges me. He said, that's not true. And I double-checked myself after I got home, and then I forwarded to him 3 articles that said the same thing. What I'm referring to is, when you buy a house in Israel, you do not buy the land. You only buy the structure itself above the land. The government owns the land. You get a 49-year lease, and then you can get a renewal of another 49 years. So you're looking at a 98-year lease on the property. There is something called freehold, but if you're talking about 93%, with the government owning the next two, the freehold and the church land, would be a total of 7%. And when you look at the last item, church land, and the Greek Orthodox, I would assume that most of that 7% is eaten up by the Greek Orthodox, because it refers to it, and the language used in my research was significant parcels, whatever that means. Yes.
A lot of the kibbutzim have been privatized. So do the kibbutznikim, the former kibbutznikim, own their land, or is it owned by the government?
It's owned by the government. There it is, 93% of the land is owned by the government. Yes. No, I really don't. Okay, people have asked me about what does the average Israeli earn? And what you're looking at is a monthly income of $3,400, which doesn't sound like a lot of money. It's not. But most Israelis have 2 earners per household, so you're looking at an income of about $6,800. Other than the condominiums in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa, which run upwards of $1 million, up to $6-7 million, houses in outlying areas run about $350,000 for a small 3-bedroom house, or it could be a townhome or something like that. And the mortgage rates are similar to ours. Years ago, to get a mortgage in Israel, you had to put up a huge down payment. Now it's more like America, the 20%, so on and so forth. So if you're looking, I'll get to you in a second. So if you're looking at the $6,800, $7,000 a month, you could just equate it to what it is to buy a $350,000, $400,000 house. It's pretty tight, and the taxes are high. Yes, sir. No, that's monthly, it says there, average monthly income is $3,400 per worker. Double that is $6,800 per month, which is between 70 and 80,000 a year. And with their other expenses and everything like that, and homes being what they are, it's pretty tight, yes.
Is this before or after taxes?
That's gross. That's before, that's what I said, that's what I said a minute ago, with the taxes they have to pay and everything, it's pretty tight. The professions most in demand are doctors, marketing, business, and technology. The doctors in Israel do not earn the kind of money that the doctors do here in America. As a matter of fact, in the early years when I first started traveling to Israel in the 80s and 90s, the highest earners of the wage earners were the guides, and they earned considerably more than the doctors. Those years, the doctors were earning $55,000, $60,000 a year, and that was considered a very good and high salary. I should qualify what I said. The highest wage earners were guides. Actually, LL pilots earned higher than the guides, but so I'll correct myself. And 21% of the population lives below the poverty line, and when you take into account the ultra-Orthodox, many of whom don't work and live off government subsidies, that would pull that number down. You have the Israeli Arabs that don't do as well as the Jewish Israelis, so on and so forth. But it's 21% is the number. We're going to move away. Any other questions about the economy? Yes, Phil. Well, we can safely assume that the 30 billionaires live in 30 of them. That's a for sure, okay? It was, I think, a couple of years ago, in one of the images that I did in this discussion about the economy, I did a little bit of a dive into the condominiums. And the Tel Aviv is the most expensive city to live in as a city. Caesarea is also very, very expensive, but that's generally the greater Tel Aviv area. Tel Aviv is the highest, Jerusalem second, and Haifa. The average condo in Haifa was over $1 million, and in a new high-rise. Okay, I mean it's mind-boggling, but they're selling them, yes.
My daughter moved out of Tel Aviv because she couldn't afford the rent there anymore. It's
Right.
telling me that a lot of Jewish, French people are buying up the condominiums along the seashore that you can see a nice view of the cities. And they'll come, but it's also a fall safe for them in case something happens to the French Jews. It's a place for them to.
The comment, in case you didn't hear it, and it's very true, and you mentioned the French Jews, and I think your daughter's totally correct, but it's other communities that are at risk, where the Jews who are wealthy want an escape valve, and they want to keep their lifestyle up, and yeah, they're buying those as vacation homes, just like people buy in Hilton Head. And they buy them in Israel, and they go there for the period of time. They also can rent them out if they care to, if the HOA in the building allows it, depending on where they buy. So you're right, but it's not only France, it's other countries at risk. The oligarchs in Russia bought a lot of Jewish ones, bought a lot of property in Israel for that same reason. Then again, I mentioned that I came from Miami Beach. A lot of Russians did the same thing in Miami Beach, and specifically a lot of the high-end condos, almost the entire building were bought up by Russians. Okay. We're going to take a quick look at the IDF. Every 2 years, the commanding officer of the IDF changes. They just had the changeover, and I found it very interesting that the new commander-in-chief of the IDF is observant, the first time ever. The kinetic action this year, unfortunately, happened. The response happened on August 5th through the 7th, when the Hamas began and Islamic Jihad began firing rockets into Israel, and Israel went in, and from the 5th, 6th, and 7th, they ran 147 sorties by the Israeli Air Force. The intake of rockets was roughly 1,000 rockets coming from Palestinian Jihad, and it's Palestinian Islamic Jihad. That's why it's PIJ. 20% of them fell on in their own territory, never made it out of Gaza, and 97% were destroyed by the Iron Dome. Recently, in January, there was a absolutely huge exercise between the United States military and Israel, and it was the largest ever, actually. It involved thousands of people, 142 aircraft, and dozens of ships, and a host of drones all over the Mediterranean. I found some interesting information about the IDF. They did a survey, and the survey, this is only highlights of the survey, it's not the entire survey, but they were asked if there should be a mandatory draft. And what surprised me is 41% of them, 47%, excuse me, I'm losing my point. 47 said to discontinue the mandatory draft. They're having morale problems in Israel, and it's been exacerbated by judicial reform in particular, but it's not the same spirit that the young Israelis used to have when getting out of high school. Like our kids look forward to getting into college right away, the Israelis look forward to their military service because it's a linchpin to their career, whether they stay in the military, whether they go on to college or choose to go into anything else. It's not the same as it used to be, unfortunately. Combat service for women, the majority, a solid majority, agree that women should serve. 35% disagree. I put in the little box, Air Force Unit 669 is a unit that's much like our SEALs, high, very, very difficult to get into, very difficult to pass through the physical aspects of becoming a member of that unit. Well, women, it's open to women now, but they're not faring too well. And as you could see, only 1 out of 11 passed. There are 3 rounds. There are a total of 3 rounds they have to go through in training, and only 1 out of 11 women have passed the first phase of it.
Your statistics, what's the sample size?
Don't know.
The 47% is 40% of.
Don't know.
So that means that those numbers are not really reliable.
You could say that. Could say that. It's an indicator, yes. The question is the Jewish population armed in Israel? The only people that have guns in Israel are those that are on active duty that can take their guns home. But you and I could not own a handgun in Israel. So, yes.
If you live in the West Bank,
Oh.
you're allowed to own a gun.
Well, yeah, the West Bank. The point was if you live in the West Bank, you can carry any weapon that you care to. Right.
But they can carry them into the regular territory of Israel as well.
Israel proper. Once again, she said that they can carry their weapons into Israel proper. I don't know.
I know,
For fact, they can.
yes.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. And grading operations. And this statistic was done among active members of the military, feel their combat readiness is good to great, overwhelmingly 71%. morale and conduct, again, once they're in, is excellent. And this is always interesting. What is their opinion about exemption of Orthodox? And that's part of the issues that are controversial with the judicial reform and an array of controversial issues about whether or not the Orthodox will serve. And you could see almost half of them believe that they're opposed to the Orthodox serving in the military. 40% support them serving, and 11% just didn't know. Now we get into politics. And again, I have to stress, these are not my own views. These are I try to interpret the views of the Israelis. The election, the fifth election, was held on November 1st, and the Netanyahu government was sworn in on December 29th. And because he's the head of the Likud party, Benjamin Netanyahu became the prime minister once again. And just for those of you that don't know, most of you do, I'm sure, that the Knesset consists of 120 seats. In order to form a government, you need 61 seats. And this is what they were able to achieve. And this is why the Netanyahu government has control. The Likud, which is Netanyahu's party, which is right, secular right party, 32 seats, and he wound up with more seats than any other party, and therefore was able to form the government. The religious Zionists, or the ultra-nationalists, 14 seats, were what put him into office, and that's one of the major problems today. You have Ben Gvir and Smotrich, two radicals, one of whom is a disciple of Maya Kahani from the Koch party, and super nationalists, hate the Palestinians. I mean, they're really tough. They're not nice people. Then you have the two Orthodox parties, Shas, which got 11 seats, and it's the Sephardi Mizrahi. And for those of you who don't know, the difference between a Sephardic Jew and a Mizrahi Jew is, just picture where Israel is. Any Jewish person that lives from northern Israel all the way around to Spain, Italy, and Portugal, and so on and so forth, is a Sephardic Jew. Anybody that lives in Egypt all the way over to Morocco is a Mizrahi Jew. United Torah are the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi Jews, and together they formed the government. Now, I just saw a poll this morning. I didn't have a chance to change the image, and it's a whole new ballgame now. As a result, this is a poll that was just released this morning. If an election were held this next week, Benny Gantz could form a government. Why? Because the religious Zionists have dropped to 4 seats. They lost 10. Likud only got, now on the new poll, 26. They have dropped 6 seats. Gantz's coalition, which you'll see in a second, I'll show it to you now, that coalition you're looking at right now would come up to 69 seats, because Benny Gantz's party, National Unity, jumped from 12 seats to 26 seats. And Benny Gantz, incidentally, was Netanyahu's supposed partner. They were supposed to alternate the prime ministership, and then Netanyahu collapsed the government before Gantz had a chance to take over. Benny Gantz is a former commander-in-chief of the IDF. He's a military guy. And so I don't want to get ahead of myself. We'll talk again in judicial reform. But you could see why Netanyahu now has to hold on to every one of the seats. And even the radicals, when they want to do something, he's fearful of them dropping out, because if they drop out, the government goes. If the government goes, there are new elections. He's out of power. And Incidentally, the United Arab List and Hadash Ta'al are both Arab parties. They split. They had formed. They had joined together in the last election, and one of their leaders decided to become part of the government, and the radical Israeli Arabs that are loyal to Hamas and Jihad decided to back out and form their own party. So there's a schism in the Israeli Arab community, although it's just as a side note, there have been a lot of problems in the Israeli Arab towns. The Palestinian flags are being flown from houses. There are a lot of issues, notwithstanding judicial reform. There are problems within the Israeli Arab community right now. Yes. Okay, that's a very good question. If you take a look at the coalition, and you need 61 seats to control the government, if Shas dropped out of he got the head of Shas, who happens to be Ayer Deri, who's not allowed to, because he was convicted of a gift to his brother, is not allowed to officially serve. A prime minister in the state of Israel, if indicted, can serve as prime minister. Anything below a prime minister, if you're a minister and you're indicted, you're not allowed to serve. Well, he was indicted. He did a plea deal, no jail time, and it was over some sort of bribery or gift to his brother. His name is Deri. He's the head of Shas. Well, he's not allowed to officially be the head of Shas, but he's running Shas from his house. If he and Netanyahu don't agree on something and he says, the heck with you, I'm out of there, 64 minus 11 is below the number you needed, the government collapses and they have a new election. Now, in order to get a seat, you have to amass 3.5% of the gross number of votes. So if 4 million people voted, you're looking at about 170, 180,000 votes to get a seat. That's what qualifies you. It used to be 1.5%, and about 7-8 years ago they upped it to 3.5%, because when it was 1.5%, they had about 30 parties. It was too fractionalized. It's still too fractionalized, but they thought they solved the problem to a degree by raising the percentage. And I think someday they're going to raise the percentage again, and I think it would be good because you'd be dealing with fewer parties. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry? The system is totally different. It's a parliamentary form of government, and I'll get into the government a little bit when I go into the court system.
So you say anyone except the prime minister is subject to this disqualification. Who made the rule that the prime minister was disqualified?
They have, in Israel, they have what they call the basic laws, and if you just hold that question, you'll see they don't have a constitution, do not have a constitution, but they do have a system they call basic laws, and that's where it evolves from, okay? Now, if Netanyahu were to be convicted with any of the three cases, then he'd have to leave office. I don't know who saw him on Meet the Press yesterday. Netanyahu was one of the interviewees, and according to him, and it's my information from what I'm reading, is the cases against him are falling apart. The government made a very, very bad mistake. A software company in Israel developed software that you could intercept conversations in people's personal cell phones. And the government was using that and getting information about Netanyahu, and that's what the lawyers call exculpatory evidence. They didn't say anything about it, and that could kill all three cases against him. That alone can do it. And then, of course, they do have an appellate system in Israel, so he could appeal these cases in perpetuity. As long as he lives, he can keep appealing it. They're not quite, but if it could run years. So does that answer the fine? Let me just... I went the wrong way. Okay, what are the, politically speaking, what are the crucial issues facing Israel? I'm going to just briefly go over them very quickly. They're very serious, but these are the external threats. And then I talk about the internal threats because that segues into the judicial reform problem they're having right now. The biggest external threat they have is Iran and the nuclear threat. That ties in with Hezbollah, Hamas, and unfortunately with Hezbollah and Hamas, because not only is Iran increasing its nuclear threat, they too have a lot of good scientists there, and they're developing weaponry that's pretty sophisticated, and they're giving that weaponry to these terrorist groups. And I have something I'm going to bring up at the very end when we talk about Iran in a little bit of depth. At any rate, that's the biggest external threat. Then we have the arsenal. It is estimated that Hezbollah has approximately 150,000 rockets buried in southern Lebanon. And the Israelis know where they are, but stopping them could be a major issue. An external threat, and I mean it, is the United Nations. They are continually bashing Israel, passing legislation, anti-Israel legislation. The organizations like UNRWA are virtually anti-Israel, so on and so forth. And maintaining decent Russian relations is a major problem for Israel. Why is it a major problem? Because up until about 2 months ago, Israel had with Russia what they called a deconfliction agreement. A deconfliction agreement meant that the Russians and the Israelis allowed each other to fly planes over their territory. The Russians said, just let us know when you're coming. And at least once a week, sometimes twice a week, the Israeli Air Force are either going in to Syria to take out weapons factories, so on and so forth, that Iranian and Hezbollah factories and storage facilities, so on and so forth, at least once a week. And it was necessary because the Russians are flying their planes all over Syria, and they had to have this agreement. Well, Russia is very angry with Israel, at first over the Ukraine situation. At first, Israel took a step back when we first got involved in the Ukraine. Then they were forced into doing something, so they decided to announce that they're going to provide humanitarian aid to the Ukrainians, which they did. No weapons. And they were getting pressure from the United States and others to do their share of weapons, which they chose not to do because of the Russians. Well, they decided now to give them some military aid, and the Russians are furious with them, and they canceled the deconfliction unit, the deconfliction agreement. So now they're going in on their own, and hopefully they won't interfere or shoot down a Russian plane, God forbid, with Russians, because they would be held to pay if they did. So it's walking a very thin rope with the Russians. Yes.
Why are the Russian planes flying over Syria?
Okay, that's an excellent question. The backstory, and I'll do it as briefly as I can. After World War II, the Middle East was split up by the victors. Russia was one of the victors. Russia chose Syria. Nobody else chose Syria. And they embraced Assad's father. My Arabic is not good. My Hebrew's no better. At any rate, and he made a deal with them, and they built a major seaport there for their Russian warships, and then subsequently built a humongous Air Force base there. That is their Air Force base for the Middle East, in Syria. So they've had a foothold in Syria for years and years and years. They beat all of us, so they've had, in effect, control. Their biggest problem in Syria is not Israel, it's not the United States, it's Iran, but that's a whole different scenario. We're not going to go there right now. So, does that answer the question about that? Okay, fine. The external... No, we talked about Russian relations. Now, the last slide is the waning of U.S. support, and I hope this doesn't aggravate some people here, but the support for Israel with the present administration is on the decline, big time. And as a result of that, I'll give you a Gallup poll, not a Republican poll, not a Democrat poll, probably one of the finest polling companies in the world. On March 26, just a few days ago, well, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, did the following survey in America. The size of the sample was something like 1,200 some odd, whatever scientific method they use for polling, it always seems to be 1,200 selected Americans, okay? Among Democrats, for the first time in the 75-year history of Israel, 48% of Democrats favor the Palestinians over the Israelis. 38% favor the Israelis, and 11% didn't care. First time ever, the Republicans, 78% of Republicans favor Israel, 11% favor Palestinians. You look at groups like the Progressive Israel Network, which is a composition of a bunch of ultra liberal groups. Unfortunately, it includes in that roster of organizations is J Street, and their agenda, their stated agenda, is protection of Palestinian rights and end the occupation, and they use the word apartheid on a regular basis, so on and so forth. There's another organization that Ron DeSantis was delivering a speech 2 days ago, and I'm not a fan, I'm not supporting, I'm just making a comment having to do with this. 2 women attacked him on the stage. Did you see that news report? Those 2 women I didn't know they were Jewish, had never mentioned it. The 2 women that attacked him belonged to an organization called If Not Now. It's If Not Now, it's one word. They are of this group of the Progressive Israel Network, they are the most radical. They would like to see Jewish Israel go down in flames. Please check them out. Don't go by me, fact check me on that one. If Not Now. Okay, now, staying with politics, what are the crucial internal issues that Israel's dealing with? I capitalized judicial reform. Yes, Judy? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't cover the last. That's the JCPOA. That organization, okay, fine. The Progressive Israel Network supported the JCPOA. That acronym is the Iran nuclear deal, which is off the table now. They were against the United States moving our embassy to Jerusalem, and they want us to end support of AIPAC. That really should have been indented under agenda. It was just a graphic mistake on my part, because those were supposed to come under it. Thank you, Judy, for pointing that out. I thought it was pretty important. Okay, I capitalized judicial reform because that is the most serious threat ever facing Israel in its 75-year history. The president of Israel, Herzog, said, "We're on the edge of the abyss." That's a direct quote, and he doesn't mince words. There's a little bit better news toward the end of it, but nevertheless, so let's leave it there for a second. I'm going to come back to it. We have, just like we have in our cities here in America, all of a sudden the crime is getting out of hand in Israel. It's rising, and I'm not talking about Palestinian terrorism. I'm talking about carjacking, I'm talking about robberies, I'm talking about being accosted on the street, so on and so forth. There is a police shortage, which may have a very direct tie into the rise in crime. They can't get policemen to work. I guess the salaries are contributing to it, or the people don't want to take their life in their hands. Whatever the reason, it's a shortage. Over the past 3 years, not this year, I delved into the housing shortage in Israel and talked about it. It remains. And then when you see Aliyah numbers coming up, it exacerbates the problem. You're talking about, 200,000 new immigrants, new population coming in. It exacerbates the housing problem. And of course, the Netanyahu trials are a problem. I mentioned the alienation of the Israeli Arabs, Palestinian flags being flown in traditional Arab cities. Arab Israeli cities are mainly in the Galilee area up near Lake Kinneret, or the Sea of Galilee, whichever you want to call it. And the terrorism, the deaths, the shootings from Palestinians is rampant again, once again, and Mahmoud Abbas will not talk to the Israelis. He won't get into any conversations with them. Gaza, of course, is a continuing problem, and the Mahmoud Abbas is serving in the 17th year of a 4-year term. And he already called elections 5 times and then called them off before the election because the last 2 were called off for a very specific, scary reason. Because their internal polling in the West Bank showed that if the election were held, that Hamas would win more votes and Hamas would take over the Palestinian Authority, and the entire West Bank and Gaza would be controlled by Hamas. And that's a very, very, very real problem.
Who called off the elections?
He did. He doesn't want to lose out. He's, I was going to say he's an old man, he's 86, but I'm 83, so I don't know what to tell you about that. I don't think I could run the Palestinian Authority. I choose not to anyway. Yes, Bob? Okay, that's a very interesting point. I read probably the same article you did, and I almost incorporated it. The radicals within the Netanyahu government want to form their own police department. Well, let me back off. I grew up in Borough Park, Brooklyn. Borough Park, Brooklyn is the seat of Orthodox Jewry in New York City now. And they have their own police department. They have the New York City police, but they have their own police department. They have 6 cars, and they're sworn deputies, okay? So it's these radicals who originate in Brooklyn are only modeling what they have in Brooklyn. And they're forming their own police department to patrol their areas, because of the Palestinians taking so many lives. And these people are ruthless. So we haven't heard the end of it. It's a vigilante group. But you're right, Bob. They are forming some sort of police department, but it's not sanctioned by the normative policing authorities. Okay, in order to understand judicial reform, I think you have to understand what the court system is like in Israel. First of all, they have a set of courts called religious courts. Any dispute that you have in the state of Israel that has to do with religion, whether it be marriage, divorce, et cetera, goes to the religious courts, do not go to the secular courts. And of course, the Jewish rabbinic court, we know it as the Bet Din, ruled by halakha, and always 3 judges, 3 rabbis that are the judges. The Muslim courts, I am not familiar with the structure of them, but they are guided by Sharia law, just like we're guided by Torah law. And then the Christian courts, because there are so many Christian groups, they have 10 different courts. So the Catholics would go to one, and the Armenians would go to another, and the Greek Orthodox would go to another, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they have their religious courts. In the secular courts, it's subdivided like you're seeing it on the screen. Immigration is pretty clear, and it has to do with any issues that you have with visas and immigration status. I guess the law of return, perhaps, would come under that. The labor movement in Israel was much stronger at one time. It's not as strong as it used to be. As a matter of fact, if you remember from the numbers, the Labor Party in Israel is down to 4 seats. The Labor Party is the party of Ben Gurion, and really, even though they never won a majority in the Knesset, they ruled the Knesset until Menachem Begin came along and embraced Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, and that changed the dynamics of the politics in Israel. But the labor movement, which evolved from the kibbutz movement, of course, et cetera, is still prevalent and strong. They're just not as dominant as they were at one time. Be that as it may, they have their own labor courts. We do here in America. We have the National Labor Relations Board, which has their own courts as well. Am I right, Bill? Then they have a magistrate court system. Their magistrate civil courts will deal with any case that's up to $850,000. Their small claims court deals up to $10,000. Here in Georgia, the small claims court, we deal with up to $15,000. And there's it depends on what state you're in. There are some states that still deal in magistrate court with cases that don't exceed $5,000. At any rate, in Israel, it's $10,000 maximum. They deal in real estate cases, and in all traffic citations, they have a traffic court. The military has its own court system, as we do here in America. If we are moving up the line, they have district courts in Israel, and all appeals of magistrate cases are handled at the magistrate appellate court in the district courts. Any huge cases go to the district court. Criminal cases that involve major crimes where the punishment would be 7 years or more, over 7 years, goes to that court. It says large corporations, and I don't know what large corporations mean. I remember in economics class when I was in undergraduate school, we were learning about farm subsidies, and we had a PhD, Dr. Bullock, who was our professor, and he was talking about the large farms versus the small farms. So one guy, and it wasn't me, raised his hand and said, "Dr. Bullock, how do you differentiate between a large?" And he said, "Well, you can safely assume that the large farms are larger than that of the small farms." So we can safely assume that the large corporations are larger than the small corporations. Partnership, any disagreement with partnerships go to the district courts, tax issues, and anything involving the government. Then we come to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of Israel is an appellate court only. And now, why all the problems with judicial reform? Oh, there are some notes that I included I had forgotten about. There are no jury trials in the state of Israel. There is no written constitution, only the basic laws, which I'll show you in a minute. There's one house of parliament, unlike the United Kingdom, which has the 2 houses. They just have the Knesset. The Knesset members have no tie to geography like we have in the House and Senate here. They all get voted on in a general election, and the judiciary is the only check on government power. Okay, they do not have a constitution. that statement, I happened to be doing some research about the basic laws, and lo and behold, a quote from Ken Stein surfaced. Ken, as you know, is Professor Emeritus, Emory University, was the founder of the Israel Center there, known lecturer. He was Jimmy Carter's Middle East advisor, and until they had a breach, so on and so forth. Well, he said country passed series of basic laws that have become the country's essential constitution foundation. That was the direct quote from him. You can see where they focused over the years. There are 14 basic laws, and they keep tweaking them, and you could see over the years how they, I'm not going to go into each one of them because it's not really necessary, I don't believe, but you could see that they're constantly updating the basic laws, but no constitution. Okay, now, the government, the current government wants, and this is where it all comes down to, two things. They want the Supreme Court, decisions by the Supreme Court, to be overruled by the Knesset. That is the entire crux of judicial reform, backed up by how do you appoint judges, and I'll get into that in 1 second. The opposition, which is the think that if judicial reform passes as it's being presented, that it'll turn Israel from a democracy to a theocracy. Netanyahu said on Meet the Press yesterday that is absurd. But again, that's a direct quote that's on the lips of a lot of people that are anti-judicial reform. And of course, part of judicial reform are the religious laws, and they're dealing with the law of return. The law of return means authentic Jews, a Jew that's 1/4 Jewish, married to a Jewish person, et cetera, can come into Israel and get benefits that other people who are welcome to come to Israel don't get. And so they want to tweak that. They want to make it harder to come in Israel. They want to get rid of the 1/4. They want to, they're questioning the marriage of a non-Jewish person to a Jewish person that comes from another country. That's under discussion. They want to, on the buses, they want to, on the trains, they want gender separation. They want women's buses separate from men's buses. They want exemption for military duty. We talked about that earlier. Kashrut relating to hospitals, that happened right before Passover. They didn't want to allow chametz to come into the hospitals anymore, non-Pesach food. That was part of the issue. Gay rights, under judicial reform, they won't recognize gay rights at all. The other side, of course, wants full and absolute rights to be given all people that are part of that community. The rights of certain businesses to sell certain products, and the problems of blocking the roads. That has to do with the demonstrations. Now, I'm sorry? Yeah, it had to do with products that were sold, were produced in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, and how it's labeled. That's the issue there. Okay, now, so what has evolved over the past several weeks? The protests, the numbers have exceeded 500,000 people demonstrating. The bunch of reservists that are not being scheduled for call-up, they're disregarding it. Netanyahu had a visit to Europe, to Italy, to visit with the prime minister. They couldn't find a pilot that was willing to fly him. They refused. They went through a list. They finally, a list of 24 pilots. The 25th pilot said he would fly him, and they put a crew together. That's how bad it is. Not only the business community is threatening divestment, pulling their investments out of Israel, it's already happening. The stock market took a real hit in the last few days. They've had enormous letter-writing campaign from high-tech leaders, from over 100 economists, from educators. It crosses all levels of society in Israel this anti-judicial reform. The Moody's did downgrade. You're exactly right. That just happened, what, Friday? Late last week? Yeah. The illustration you see on the right happened to be the back cover of the Jerusalem Report 3-4 weeks ago, and it shows various elements of the Jewish community fighting one another, and it says a lot. It's an editorial cartoon, obviously, that means a lot. It says a lot. Now, those are some photographs that I pulled from the files showing the demonstrations. Not a single person has been killed in a demonstration, I'm happy to say. So they've been boisterous, but not dangerous, which is good. I mean, the arguments have been there, but nobody has been killed. And that's our Israel. That's what it looks like. Yes.
So the recent attacks from Lebanon and Gaza and other places in Israel seem to be coincident with these protests. Is that because those terrorist groups view Israel as vulnerable?
Those attacks, what Ray is referring to is, for the first time in a number of years, there were rockets sent in from Lebanon into Israel. They were not sent by Hezbollah. They were sent by dissident Palestinians who live in Lebanon. There are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that are descendants, maybe more than hundreds of thousands, from the Palestinians that left Israel voluntarily in 1948 when the Grand Mufti told them to leave for 48 hours or for 2 weeks, whatever it was, and come back, and they could never come back. That's who's there. That didn't have anything to do with judicial reform, Ray. What it had to do with was a group of Jews going up to the Temple Mount and began praying. And then a bunch of Palestinians started throwing rocks at them and other things. The police jumped in. 300 Palestinians were backed into the Alaska Mosque, which is a humongous mosque if you've ever seen it. And the policemen went into the mosque after them and did major arrests. That was the linchpin for the firing from Lebanon. Now they know there's a weakness going on, but then again, the IDF is still doing their sorties into Syria. That hasn't stopped anything. There were some rockets that did come in from Gaza, but they determined it came from Jihad and not Hamas. And again, that was because of what happened in the Temple Mount, not judicial reform. Yes, sir.
Previous item listed the issues that were related to the judicial reform concern.
Yeah.
From what you're saying, without a constitution, is it correct that the Supreme Court is the only real safeguard on the legislature, on the Knesset?
It's hard for me to hear back here. I'm going to...
I mean, the Supreme Court is the guardrails on the Knesset, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So in theory, if there's no guardrails anymore, the Knesset could pass any law, right? I mean, they could pass a law saying only ultra-Orthodox can own property in Israel.
Right.
Arabs cannot. And there would be no Supreme Court to overrule it, or if they did, they would just overturn it.
Well,
There's no checks and balances.
But they have no constitution, and without a Supreme Court, there are no guardrails.
they're trying to keep a judiciary independent of the Knesset, okay? That's where it's all at. They don't, now, there's also a side note to this, and Netanyahu yesterday denied it, and he said that's absurd, that he would like the Knesset, which he controls through majority government, to overrule any ruling of the Supreme Court. That, again, I call that the crux of the problem. Why? Because if he's convicted and he appeals it, he wants them, the Knesset, to...
I'm not so much worried about his conviction. In the U.S., we have a constitution. You could amend it, but it takes 2/3 of the Senate
Yeah, yeah, you're 100% right. Yeah, I hope I didn't say anything to contrary to
The
that.
list of concerns you had up there weren't as onerous as the potential list could be.
Okay, well, yeah, again, the crux of the problem is having an independent judiciary versus a Knesset that controls the courts. And that's where it's at. And then how you appoint judges, and I'm going to get to that in a second. That's number two, how the judges are, because the judges in the Supreme Court have been activist judges too. They've overstepped their authority a little bit as well. And there have been instances of that. So that the other side has kind of a legitimate argument there also. There should be a fairer way to appoint judges, and I'm going to show you that in a second, because President Herzog did suggest a compromise, and I'll show you what his compromise was, which was rejected, but there's newer news than what I have on the images. Yeah, Jack had his hand up first. I'm sorry? Okay. Yes, Bill?
Could you repeat his question?
He didn't have a question. He said it was,
Couldn't hear his.
he said it was,
Because they've got 64 members of the Knesset. And so what they're trying to do, and especially the right-wing people, is to get into law. You know, bypass the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would become irrelevant at that point. To get into law now, what they want to do, including basically even incorporate it with the right-wing part of So it's not a question of 20 years, it's right now what they're trying to do.
All safeguards are gone.
Right, absolutely.
I'm going to,
Well, in fact, according to the U.S., we still have a constitution that hopefully at some point somebody will say.
I'm going to pick up the pace because we're running out of time, and so I'm going to go through this. This plan that I'm about to show you was suggested by the President of Israel, who heretofore was more or less a figurehead. That really, until Shimon Peres became president and added more legitimacy to it and more stature, and then the last president, and then this president came from old Israeli families and brought a lot of prestige to the office, so on and so forth. And he has become a master mediator in this. This is what he proposed. Without going into it, it was a lot of shifting around that he wanted to do. You can see what it says there. In effect, he made this proposal on a Thursday. Oh, I think it was 2 weeks ago on a Thursday. And I incorporated the image. By the time I got the image on the screen that night, Netanyahu rejected it. So I could have a big word rejected on this. But it shows you the maneuvering, how the Judicial Appointments Committee, and Jack, that's what you were leading up to, the Judicial Appointment Committee, which does exist, okay? The president wants to have the committee comprised, as you see, of a mixture of people from the opposition as well, so everybody gets a say in who appoints the judges. Unlike, there's a huge patronage system right now, and it's very political. Herzog wants to take it out of the politics, and the good news, if there's any good news about it, and that was as of actually today, word coming out of the president's home, out of the president's residence where they meet, was they may be able to work out a compromise. Compromise is really the only way to go with this thing. The only answer is one of two things. They either have to compromise or the government has to collapse the government. If they do, then they'll have, this time I think they would have a centrist government running Israel, which is what it should be. It'll be the end of Netanyahu, because if he collapses the government, I think he'll lose control of Likud. There are others that want his position, so on and so forth, and that'll be the end of his tenure. He's done great things for Israel. I mean, he really has, but it may be his time to go, and I hate myself for saying so because I'm a fan. At any rate, just jumping to foreign affairs, just leaving that, Israel, and foreign affairs, I talked about Iran. That gives you a little bit of a picture of where Iran is right now. It's a country of almost 90 million people. The GDP is the 11th largest in the world. GDP per capita, they're a very poor country. You could see what it is right there. Only 14% of the women work, which affects the labor force, a lot of poverty. The problem is, and I'm just going to mention this, well, let me go to this. Whoops, sorry. Before I go to that, this is brand new over the last few days. The Saudis have made peace with the Iranians, something that nobody thought could happen because the Saudis represent the Sunni Islamic community and the Iranians is the center of Shiite or Shia Islam. And for them to get together was unbelievable. They're exchanging ambassadors. They're going to have embassies in each country. And this is to Israel's absolute detriment. Unfortunately, and please, the Israelis feel that they were shafted by the current administration with the Saudis because of the Biden administration is not getting along with the Saudis. The prince would not even take his telephone call about a month and a half ago, so on and so forth. The Saudis, and they felt in their own best interest is to get into bed with the Iranians. And who mediated that deal? The Chinese. So the dynamics in the Middle East are changing drastically, and it's not good for Israel. Those are Israel's major concerns with Iran. Iran continuing to influence throughout Africa. They're moving into South. They're buying up lands and influencing Latin America. It's problematic. I put in there Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is a small country that happens to be sandwiched between Russia and Iran, and it's been very friendly toward the Jews. It has, I think, the second largest Jewish community in the Arab world now. The first one, I think, is Turkey. At any rate, they have about 20,000 Jews. They never had a problem with anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. Why is it so important? Number one, they're providing energy to Israel. Israel was buying most of its oil from the Iraqi Kurds, but they're changing dynamics. They took the oil away from the Kurds. The government did. That took the source of oil for the Israelis. So most of the oil is coming from Azerbaijan. And incidentally, as a side note, about 22 to 24% of Israel's energy is coming from natural gas. So they're phasing out of petroleum, but still 75% is needed. And the most important reason for staying friendly with Azerbaijan is because if they had to attack Iran, fly over Iran, that's a safe haven for their planes. They could fly into the airport. They have bases there that are large enough to accommodate Israelis. And if I were to guess, I would say that the Israelis and the Mossad and a lot of other secret organizations are on the ground with the permission of the Azerbaijanis arranging for the handling of Israeli aircraft, servicing them so they can get in the air and back where they're going. Yes, Bill?
Talking about natural gas, how long before Israel is able to get all of this natural gas, all it needs out of the Mediterranean basin?
You mean 100% of their need?
Close to that. I mean, they're nowhere near getting as much as they.
Well, they're getting tons, but they're selling a bunch to Egypt, and they're selling a bunch to Jordan. And they're starting to sell into Europe. So if they didn't, they could probably be up. But I don't know how much of a conversion they've had in Israel to natural gas from oil either. It evolves. The Israelis have among the world's largest reserves of natural gas. They just signed a deal. I'll get to it right now.
Can you tell me what mountain Jews are? They have
Mountain Jew, okay, fine. In Azerbaijan, much like Morocco, if you've been to Morocco, They have mountain Jews there also. I forget what they're called, frankly. And they live a very primitive life. They're Jews, authentic meaning Torah accepted Jews, but they live in a very primitive way. They're a very distinct group. Morocco has the same thing. And Arthur, do you remember what the name of those Jews that live in the mountains in Morocco, or Arlene, Carol? They started with a B. Berber Jews. Yeah, thank you. At any rate, that's who they are. Just very quickly, the former Prime Minister of Brazil was a great close friend of Israel's, and the new Prime Minister or President, whatever his title is not. As a matter of fact, you can see they just opening their ports to allow Iranian warships to moor there and resupply. Chad, a Muslim country, just restored diplomatic ties with Israel. Great Britain, we had a good deal going with Boris Johnson. We had a good deal going with his successor, the woman that was in office for a matter of weeks. I didn't know what the new guy would be like. As it turns out, he's a huge supporter of Israel, and you could see how the trade has increased exponentially in 2022. And also the leader of the opposition party in England is married to a Jewish woman, has 2 daughters, both of whom were raised Jewish, had bat mitzvahs. She has a family living in Israel. So even the opposition in England, it's a whole different dynamic there, because they were getting ready. If Jeremy Corbyn had been elected, you would have seen Aliyah coming from England in numbers like you've never seen before. But he's been marginalized totally, and the Jews are in much better shape in Great Britain. Honduras became the 4th country to move their embassy to Israel. Hungary, you could say what you want about their president. Some call him a dictator. He sealed the country, put a wall around the whole country, doesn't want any immigrants there. He's a nationalist, so on and so forth, but he loves Israel, and we'll take it. The natural gas, they just signed a natural gas deal with Israel did with Lebanon. The president of Lebanon made it very clear this doesn't mean that they're opening up negotiations or relations with Israel. It's just to give them what they felt was part of the huge natural gas fields that are off the coast of Israel, some of which were off the coast of Lebanon, and Lebanon thought that they should get revenue from it, and the Israelis finally made a deal with them, and Israel is getting a royalty on all the gas coming out of the ground there, so it's a good deal for everybody, and so that's good news. The last slide I have is Morocco. Morocco signed a defense pact with Israel. They were getting along very well. They're part of the Abraham Accords, of course, and but that's the first time that they're actually going to have Israeli weapons and Israeli trainers. Oman recently, that's happened within the last 2 months, they're allowing Israeli aircraft, commercial aircraft, to fly over, cutting the flights by 2 hours to the Far East. Saudi did it a couple of years ago. I guess it's still in effect also. But Oman is a big country, and them allowing it, again, it's quite a benefit. Well, this image is about a month old, and it talks about U.S. relations becoming more tense as the Saudis are drawn closer to China. How prophetic, because this was put on there long before the Chinese mediated the deal with the Saudis and the Iranians, but there it is. Spain, for those of you who traveled to Spain, a lot of us have been there, and it's a popular spot. The mayor of Jerusalem, for whatever reason, is anti-Israel. He canceled the Twin City arrangement, and the mayor of Barcelona, that is, and he called Israel an apartheid state. Why? Who knows? Because a lot of Israelis travel there too. Major change during 2022 toward the second half was making friends with Turkey again, and Erdogan It was his idea. He finally came around. They had been kind of enemies since the flotilla incident of a number of years ago, and things are looking better and opening embassies, and Herzog visited, the president visited there. I talked about the Ukraine and about Russia telling Israel not to supply, and et cetera, et cetera. So the dynamics there are changing a little bit, and that is it. Any last questions? Yes, Phil?
Wasn't there a recent disruption between Turkey and Israel?
Between what?
Turkey and Israel?
Between Germany and Israel?
Turkey and Israel.
Oh, yeah, he's a schizophrenic. That's not a medical comment, that's an emotional one. Yeah, he blows with the wind. Yeah, he'll be mad for a week or two, and then he'll see. The main reason he wanted to get close with Israel, because Israel's about to make a major gas deal with Greece and Cyprus to produce natural gas to go there onto Europe, and he didn't like it. He wanted the deal himself. So that's what precipitated that deal. Now, yeah, he's not a good guy.
He's also in a really tight race for the presidency next month.
The current election there, you mean?
Yeah, in Turkey, it's next month, May, for the presidency. He's very, very tight race with his opposition.
Oh, he'll kill him. You don't have to worry. He'll take him out. Okay.